Cale Thorne's head throbbed as he came to, his senses assaulted by the cold metal beneath him and the harsh, synthetic air filling his lungs. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the disorientation. For a few seconds, all he could hear was the steady hum of alien machinery, nothing familiar. The Zarek ship had captured him, but he wasn't dead. Yet. He forced himself to sit up, his body protesting with sharp pains. The world tilted, but Cale didn't give in. Marine training was about resilience, endurance, fighting back no matter the odds. As his vision cleared, he saw the dull, gray walls of a holding cell, a strange blend of sleek alien technology and suffocating coldness. His wrists were bound in heavy, glowing shackles that pulsed with a strange energy, rendering him immobile for now. His side burned from a previous blow, but the pain felt more like a reminder. A reminder that he wasn't finished. Not yet. Cale tested the shackles. The energy held firm, but his mind worked furiously. He could break them, he had to. The Zarek underestimated humans, as most aliens did. They thought they could easily crush a species that barely had a foothold in the galaxy. But they hadn't met him. And they hadn't met the rest of humanity. A loud clank echoed through the chamber, followed by the low hiss of the door opening. 2 Zarek guards entered, their bioluminescent armor reflecting the cold light of the chamber. Their elongated limbs moved with a chilling grace, and their golden eyes glinted with a sense of superiority. The Zarek were proud, but pride often blinded the strongest of creatures. One of them, the taller of the two, spoke in their alien tongue. The words were unintelligible, but the meaning was clear. Cale was nothing more than a trophy to them. He was their prize. And they were about to break him. But Cale wasn't the type to break easily. Not after everything he'd fought through. He forced a smile. If you think I'm going to beg, you're wasting your time. The taller Zarek stepped forward, his mandibles twitching in what could have been amusement, or irritation. You will beg, he said in a rough, guttural voice, switching to the common galactic tongue. All creatures break. Your kind is no different. Cale locked eyes with him. Keep dreaming. Humans don't break. We just keep coming. The Zarek's gaze darkened, and he stepped back, signaling his companion to move Cale to another part of the ship. We shall see, the guard muttered, though the venom in his voice was palpable. The second Zarek grabbed Cale's arm, yanking him to his feet with surprising strength. But the Marine was already planning his next move. Pain didn't matter. He could take it. It wasn't the physical torture that broke men, it was the mental game. And he would not lose. As they dragged him down the hall, Cale caught sight of a faintly glowing symbol scratched into the wall, a crude symbol of a fist. It was small, subtle, but it sparked something inside him. A flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. Cale Thorne sat in the cold, sterile glow of the interrogation chamber, his arms shackled behind him. The walls pulsed faintly with an alien energy, casting eerie shadows across the metallic floor. The Zarek didn't believe in subtlety. Every element of their architecture screamed intimidation. But Cale wasn't the type to scare easily. Opposite him, High Warlord Vezek leaned against the sleek console, his tall, angular frame at ease. The Warlord's golden eyes burned with cruel amusement, as if Cale were a fascinating insect pinned under glass. You humans are remarkable in your arrogance, Vezek said, his voice smooth but cutting. A species so fragile, yet so persistent. I find it amusing. Cale snorted, wincing as the motion pulled at his cracked ribs. If persistence bothers you, you're in for a rough time, pal. Vezek tilted his head, his mandibles twitching in what could have been a smirk. Tell me, Marine, he continued, circling Cale like a predator. What drives your kind to fight? You must know resistance is futile. The Zarek Empire has conquered dozens of worlds, each one stronger than yours. Cale met Vezek's gaze, his blue eyes sharp despite the blood streaking his face. We don't fight because we think we can win, he said evenly. We fight because giving up isn't in our DNA. The Warlord stopped, his expression darkening. He tapped a button on the console, and a hologram materialized between them. It showed Earth, spinning serenely in the void of space. Your world hangs by a thread, Vezek said, his tone turning venomous. Our fleets already encircle it. Your defenses are laughable. Humanity is a candle in the wind, and I hold the power to snuff it out. Kale's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd seen these tactics before, psychological warfare designed to crack the will. But Vezek had made one critical mistake: he underestimated the strength of human resolve. Big talk for a guy who's scared of a few Marines, Kale said, a faint grin tugging at his lips. What's the matter? Need to puff your chest to hide your insecurities? Vezek's claws slammed into the console, sending a harsh echo through the chamber. Enough! He snarled. His composure returned as quickly as it had vanished, but the crack in his facade was telling. You will answer my questions, or I will make your death excruciating. Kale shrugged, leaning back as far as his restraints allowed. Do your worst. I'm not the one who's afraid of the clock running out. The warlord's eyes narrowed, but before he could reply, the chamber door hissed open. A slender, blue-skinned alien shuffled in, an enslaved mechanic by the looks of it. The figure avoided eye contact, moving silently to adjust a panel on the wall. Their eyes met for a brief second, and Kale saw something unexpected: defiance. The mechanic whispered quickly, just loud enough for Kale to hear. Don't lose hope. Kale's heart steadied. He had an ally. He wasn't alone. For the first time since his capture, a spark of optimism ignited. The Zarek might be mighty, but they had no idea what they'd unleashed. Kale Thorne slumped in the corner of his cell, the cold, unyielding metal digging into his back. The dim light overhead flickered sporadically, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. He couldn't tell how long he'd been here, days, maybe more. Pain was a constant companion, but it wasn't the bruises or cracked ribs that weighed on him the most. It was the gnawing uncertainty. Marine! The voice of his captor, Vezek, still echoed in his head. Even the strongest fall when left to rot. Kale clenched his fists. If they thought isolation would break him, they didn't know Marines. His mind replayed the fleeting moment of connection with the blue-skinned mechanic who had whispered, "Don't lose hope." The cell door hissed open. Kale straightened, muscles tensing as a pair of Zarek guards strode in, their glowing armor reflecting the dim light. They dragged him upright, their claws gripping his arms like iron. "Where are we going now, boys?" Kale rasped, his voice hoarse but steady. "Another round of Vezek's bedtime stories?" The guards didn't answer, their silence unnerving. They led him through winding corridors, the hum of alien machinery reverberating around them. Every so often, Kale caught glimpses of other prisoners, humans and aliens alike, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. As they approached a large, reinforced door, Kale noticed something odd. The enslaved mechanic was there, tinkering with a nearby panel. Their hands moved with practiced efficiency, but their eyes flickered to him for the briefest moment, conveying urgency. The door slid open to reveal a sprawling chamber filled with monitors and holographic displays. At the center stood Vezek, his towering form radiating authority. He turned as Kale was forced to his knees before him. "Marine," Vezek said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I trust the accommodations have been enlightening." Kale smirked, bloodied but unbowed. "5-star service. Thinking of leaving a glowing review." Vezek's mandibles twitched in irritation. "You amuse yourself with defiance, but it changes nothing. Your kind is weak, scattered. The Zarek are inevitable." Kale leaned forward despite the guard's grip, his tone sharp. "You think strength comes from fear? You don't get it. Humans don't break. You can't crush what's built to endure." Before Vezek could reply, a subtle flicker of light caught Kale's attention. A small symbol appeared on one of the consoles, a human fist. His heart raced. It was a signal, unmistakably planted by the mechanic. Then, the lights in the chamber dimmed briefly. Vezek's head snapped toward the malfunction, barking commands in his native tongue. Kale seized the moment, twisting sharply out of the guard's grip. He didn't get far. One of the Zarek struck him hard, sending him sprawling. But the brief disruption had been enough to light a spark of hope. As they dragged him back to his cell, Kale's mind worked furiously. There was a resistance here, buried within the Zarek's fortress. The mechanic's signal was proof. They weren't alone in this fight. Kale allowed himself a grim smile. The Zarek thought they had him cornered, but they just handed him a lifeline. The game had only begun. Kale paced the narrow confines of his cell, his boots scuffing against the cold metal floor. His sides still ached from the guard's blow, but pain was a familiar companion, one he had learned to push aside. His mind raced with the possibilities sparked by the mechanic's signal. There was a resistance here, buried beneath the Zarek's brutal efficiency. And he needed to find it. The faint hum of the ship's systems filled the silence. Kale focused on the rhythm, trying to locate hidden patterns. The Zarek were meticulous, but every machine had its flaws. It wasn't just about escape anymore, it was about fighting back. The cell door hissed open, breaking his concentration. Kale tensed, expecting more guards, but instead, the blue-skinned mechanic stepped inside. They moved quickly, shutting the door behind them and glancing nervously over their shoulder. "We don't have much time," they whispered, their voice soft but urgent. Kale raised an eyebrow. "Nice to see you again. You're taking a big risk, aren't you?" The mechanic's expression hardened. "Bigger than you know. The Zarek don't tolerate disobedience." They pulled a small, glowing device from their satchel and handed it to him. "This will disrupt the energy field in your restraints. You'll need it later." Kale turned the device over in his hands, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you helping me?" The mechanic hesitated, their gaze dropping. "Because I've seen what they do to prisoners, what they plan to do to your people. The Zarek are ruthless. If we don't resist, there will be nothing left." Kale studied them for a moment, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, he nodded. "What's your name?" "Call me Rin," they said. "All right, Rin," Kale said, tucking the device into his waistband. "What's the plan?" Rin glanced at the door. "There's a core reactor 2 levels down. If we can destabilize it, we'll force an evacuation. It'll give us a chance to escape, and maybe cripple the Zarek fleet in the process." Kale leaned against the wall, considering. "And how many are with us?" Rin's shoulders slumped. "Just me, and now you." Kale exhaled sharply, a wry smile creeping onto his face. 2 against an entire warship. Sounds about right." Before Rin could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. They froze, panic flashing across their face. "Get back to your station," Kale said quietly, stepping toward the door. "Act like nothing happened. I'll be ready when the time comes." Rin hesitated but nodded, slipping out just as the guards arrived. As the door sealed shut again, Kale felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The odds were impossible, the risks monumental. But for the first time in weeks, he had a clear objective. He clenched his fists, feeling a renewed surge of determination. Humanity's survival had always hinged on its ability to adapt, to fight back against overwhelming odds. And this time would be no different. The Zarek thought they had broken him. They were wrong. The corridor outside Kale's cell was dim, lit only by the pulsing red glow of Zarek energy conduits. The guards had left hours ago, trusting that his restraints and injuries would keep him subdued. That was their first mistake. Kale activated the small device Rin had given him. It hummed faintly in his palm, releasing a soft pulse that sent a jolt through his restraints. With a sharp hiss, the energy field binding his wrists dissipated. He flexed his hands, his lips curling into a faint grin. "Show time," he muttered. He moved swiftly, his training taking over. Staying low, he crept through the winding corridors, sticking to the shadows. The hum of the ship's systems masked his footsteps, and the occasional clatter of distant machinery provided just enough cover. The core reactor was exactly where Rin had described, a cavernous chamber 2 levels down, its center dominated by a swirling sphere of energy suspended within a lattice of alien metal. The air here was thick with heat and static, the reactor's power thrumming like a living heartbeat. Kale crouched behind a console, studying the layout. The room was heavily guarded. Half a dozen Zarek soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their bioluminescent armor glowing faintly in the dim light. Rin's small figure was visible near a control panel, their movements purposeful but tense. Kale tapped his earpiece, a salvaged piece of equipment Rin had smuggled to him. "Rin, I'm in position." "You sure about this?" Rin's voice crackled softly in his ear. "The overload sequence is ready. You just need to buy me a few minutes." Kale grinned despite himself. "A few minutes? Easy. Let's make some noise." He moved quickly, grabbing a discarded piece of metal piping from the floor. With a sharp swing, he struck a nearby conduit, the clang echoing through the chamber. The guards reacted instantly, their weapons glowing as they converged on the source of the noise. Kale darted out, using the chaos to his advantage. He moved like a ghost, striking from the shadows and disappearing before the guards could retaliate. "Human!" one of them roared, its distorted voice filled with frustration. Kale smirked. "What's wrong? Thought you guys liked a challenge." The fight was brutal and fast. Kale wasn't armed, but he didn't need to be. His fists and the environment were enough. He used every bit of his marine training, ducking, weaving, and countering with precision. One by one, the guards fell, their glowing armor dimming as they hit the ground. "Kale!" Rin's voice cut through the chaos. "It's done! Get out of there!" Kale turned to see the reactor glowing brighter, its hum escalating to a deafening roar. He sprinted toward Rin, who was already making for a nearby access hatch. Together, they bolted through the narrow corridors, the ship trembling violently around them. The reactor's overload had triggered alarms, and the Zarek soldiers were in disarray. As they reached an escape pod, Kale glanced back at the chaos they'd left behind. The mighty Zarek warship, the symbol of their dominance, was falling apart at the seams. "Not bad for two against an empire," he said, grinning at Rin. Rin smiled faintly, their eyes reflecting both exhaustion and hope. "This is just the beginning." Kale nodded as the pod's hatch sealed, the stars outside blazing brightly as they jettisoned away. He wasn't sure what awaited them, but one thing was clear: humanity wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot.